Welcome to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. My name is Simeon Cheeseman and I'll be your presenter for this course. We're starting off in Section 1, Strapping Your Boots Getting Started. Subsection 1, Course Overview. First of all, about me. I graduated from the University of Auckland with a degree in Computer Science in 2011. Before that, I worked for a software development company called Straker Interactive, now Straker Translations, as a tester. After graduated, I started working for my dad's company building an internal CRM and support system. This led me to start working in Bootstrap and AngularJS. Currently, I maintain a blog at sdevgame.wordpress.com and I'm the primary maintainer for textangular.com. I self-taught myself AngularJS and Bootstrap and hope that I can make your journey a bit shorter and easier than mine. The first thing I learned on my journey is that neither Bootstrap nor AngularJS have many practical tutorials or resources. So in aid of that, we will be building an information retrieval page. As you can see here. Please note that this tutorial will not cover any kind of security considerations that you will need to be aware of when building AngularJS. Alright, so as you can see, our eventual app will have a front page where the user will insert some information. I'll go ahead and fill this out with the correct information. And as you can see, we have some tooltips and validation check marks which give some useful feedback to our user. Once we filled the form in correctly, the submit button will activate, allowing us to submit, processing a success message, and then a nice animation bringing us to our second view. This is an example of something that Angular excels at, which is single-page applications. Basically, all the HTML and JavaScript is loaded up at the start, or page load, and we can give the user multiple views for displaying data and getting input without reloading the page. During this course, all the steps to create this will be broken down and explained so that you can understand what's going on enough to be able to apply these concepts in different circumstances. To give you an idea of what we will be covering at what stage in the course, I'll demonstrate the relevant part of our app and quickly describe the section. Starting in Section 2, we will cover getting input from the user into our JavaScript code. Also, we will cover validation messages and the optional better placeholder module. As you can see, if I put a invalid email in, it will highlight up red, and we'll cover about making messages with that as well. In Section 3, we will cover form validation in more detail and how to stop users submitting invalid data. As you can see, we have a disabled submit button we can't click on, and a tooltip which tells us that we have to complete all fields with valid data to submit. Lastly, we will show how to stop users submitting multiple times and giving them some useful feedback. Here is that if you were quick enough, you spotted that it disabled the submit button while the form was submitting and then gave us a nice green bar to tell us that the data had been validated correctly. In Section 4, we will cover how to load up different pages to show different data. This is the bread and butter of single-page apps. As an optional bonus, we will cover how to get the page animations to work. The different pages are the login page and the report page. And as you can see, they have separate animations for the login and report page. In Section 5, we will cover how to display data for the user. In this case, we will be using an array of JSON objects or JavaScript object notation to display a table. We will also cover how to use filters to format data and create your own. Then, how to use checkboxes to select rows, and then use a button to output them. So as you can see, I can select some rows here, click send emails, and we get an alert here listing the emails of the rows we selected. As you also, we have the numbers formatted as a currency, the date of birth formatted as a date, and these tags formatted in a correct manner. Optionally, we will also dive into some of the difficulties that you will undoubtedly face with the ng-repeat module in AngularJS that confusing. Some context, the ng-repeat module is what drives this table to display everything the same in each row. with different data. In section 6, we will make use of the AngularStrap library, which provides some extra functionality without having to load jQuery for the Bootstrap elements. In this, we will create tooltips or popovers, as you saw in the login page. We will create modals or asides, like you see this help modal. And we will also create type heads like this name filter here. As you can see, it has filtered down as an option. We can just select that Cooper person, or if we start with Key, it shows us a list of just the people with K in their name. We can select one to load up the filter. Now that we've seen what we are going to be building, we will jump to the next video for a quick overview of how Bootstrap and AngularJS are going to work together to help us achieve this goal. Welcome to the second video of this section. Last time we had a look at the course content and what we will be able to build by the end of the course. This is subsection 2, using AngularJS with Bootstrap. In this video, we're going to have a high-level look at Bootstrap, a high-level look at AngularJS, and a high-level look at how they work together. We're going to demonstrate this by looking at how Bootstrap and AngularJS interact with the standard HTML input field. First, we will have a look at bootstrap.com. If you open up your browser and then go to getbootstrap.com like I have here, you'll see this page. And as you can see, Bootstrap is described as the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework for developing responsive, mobile-first projects on the web. Now, first, let's click on the download button. As you can see, there are many options for getting Bootstrap into our project. For this tutorial, we will just be using a CDN, or Content Delivery Network link. So we just need to save this piece of code here for later. Now we'll have a look at what Bootstrap itself is. First of all, we'll open up the CSS docs, and we can see here that obviously this page has been built using the basic building blocks of Bootstrap. And on the right here, we can see a list of the general simplest parts of Bootstrap that will be available. Alright, we'll start off by finding our input field. First of all, we'll click on the Form tab on the right, jump down to Forms, and then we'll go to the Focus state here. As you can see, this is what Bootstrap adds to your basic input field with some classes to show that it's been focused. Now, if we scroll up a bit more, we can see a live example of this. You see I click in Focus, the blue highlight appears, click out, it disappears. And that's something that Bootstrap does very nicely. Alright, that's all we'll look at for now in Bootstrap. I encourage you to go and have a look at the other parts that Bootstrap offers, but for now we'll move over to the AngularJS. Right, now here's the AngularJS site. It's angularjs.org. As you can see here, I've opened it up already. Here we can see the download link, and if we scroll down further, some videos and some examples. AngularJS is quite a bit bigger than Bootstrap, so I'd take some time to have a good look around at least the front page of the site on your own, because they have a lot of examples and good resources which will explain more of what AngularJS is. We'll cover most of it later, but if you want to get ahead of it, you're more than welcome to. Right, to start off, we'll do what we did for Bootstrap and find ourselves a CDN link. So we'll click on the download link, and we'll copy this CDN link here. Right. Now we'll go and have a look at the API documentation and see if we can find anything about the input field. First we'll click up here on Develop and then API Reference. Right. An important thing about the AngularJS docs is they have many versions up here. So the first thing we'll need to do is to select the stable version that we'll be using. Right, we'll pick 1.3.9 for now. Any stable version will do. Right, now let's go find the docs for the input in AngularJS. If we look down the nav on the left, we could find it, but it is much quicker to search in the search field up here. So if we'll type in input, and we'll look, there are quite a few options here, and we'll find just a standard input and click on that. Here you can see all the options that are available for our input directive. A directive is what Angular calls its basic building blocks. We'll come back to the details on this in a later tutorial. Right, finally, let's go back to the AngularJS homepage, which is a great example of how Bootstrap and AngularJS work together, and scroll into the basic example. If we look closely at the example here, we can see the Bootstrap styling of the input if we click into and out of it. You see there's that blue filter again, and if we type in world, we can see this is what AngularJS does best. And that is an excellent example of what we will be doing. In conclusion, we've had a look at Bootstrap and AngularJS and what they bring to the table in regards to the traditional input field. In the next tutorial, we'll start building our app by using what we've looked at here. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. Last time we introduced Bootstrap and AngularJS. This time we'll hit the ground running and build the first thing one should always build, the Hello World app. This is going to be similar to the basic example we saw on the AngularJS homepage. Right, let's get started. First, let's open up our favorite editor. For ease of setup, I'm actually going to use a plunker. This sets up for me a basic HTML page, a JavaScript file, and a style sheet automatically. If you want to follow along using your own plunker, which is free and on the web, just go to plunkr.co. First, let's edit the HTML page and add in those CDN links we saved earlier in the head section. As you can see, I've already done that here, a script tag with the URL of AngularJS's file, and the link tag containing the link to Bootstrap's CSS file. The basics of any Angular app is two attributes, ng-app and ng-controller. For this tutorial, we're going to put them in like this. We'll talk about what these mean later when we get to the JavaScript side of the app. Next, we're going to add in the first basics of the Bootstrap framework, which is the container class and its sister container fluid. These are both the wrapper that should go around all other content on the page, giving us the tools to organize the contents. Container fluid is a full-width class that always stretches the content from one side of the page to the other, whereas the container class is a fixed-width responsive class that changes its size based on the screen width. Try swapping these two classes around once we've finished this app and resizing the screen to see how it affects what the content does. For now, we're just going to add class equals container. Now let's set up the JavaScript part of Angular. First, we switch over to the script screen and we add in what's known as the module function. The name that we put into the first parameter of this function should be the same as the name of the ng-app tag in the HTML page. The second required argument of the module function is an array of dependencies. For now, we'll just leave it as an empty array. We'll fill it in later and explain what it does when we need it. Next, we'll add in the controller function. This is the logic for our page, and the name here should be the same as the ng-controller attribute name in the HTML. As you've probably noticed, the controller function is actually a function on the module that we just created. Right. Next, we have to pass in the actual function that runs to set up all of the objects, functions, and variables that we need to be able to display the data on the front end. It's a good practice to use the directive insertion version of this all the time, as it has less problems when you try to minify the file. For now, the only directive we'll need is the $scope directive, like so. Now, a directive in this case is a block of code that manages how some information is displayed to the user, and sometimes how that information is interacted with. Note that the directive names in the array before the function are the order that they are passed into the function. So you can use a different variable name if you like, and still have the same value as the function that was passed in. For example, I prefer to remove the $sign of the scope for quicker coding, but we'll leave it in for now. Now we'll add in a variable so that it can contain the data for the HTML and from the HTML. We'll call this variable name. Note that we declare this as an attribute on the scope variable. This is important to note for later, that only those objects, functions, and variables that are declared as keys on the scope object can be used in the HTML. Lastly, we'll bind the variable to an input and display binding on the front end. Alright, we'll switch back over to our HTML page again and add in the following snippet. These two classes are straight out of Bootstrap's grid structure. The first class here, row, tells Bootstrap that we are building a row of data, and the second one, col md12, says this is a 12-column cell. Now, every row in Bootstrap has 12 columns. So by saying that we're using a 12 column, means it will span the width of the page. Now we've added in our input. First of all, we've added in the form control class, which is what Bootstrap uses to know that it should apply all the Bootstrap input styling on it. And the ng model says that this input is bound to the value of the name variable on the scope that we put in the last step. Right. Let's quickly copy this and add and then change it to, instead of taking input, to be a display row like so. As you can see, I've put these curly brackets around with name in it. Now, this is AngularJS's syntax for outputting scope variables into the HTML. Now, if we open up our preview, we can see that the world value has been populated into the input from our JavaScript, and it's also being displayed here. And if we change this, the display automatically updates. In conclusion, we've learned how to set up a basic AngularJS and Bootstrap application and what some of the basics of each are and what they do. This concludes section 1. In section 2, we'll look into working with inputs in more detail. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last section, we introduced AngularJS, Bootstrap, and a basic example of AngularJS and Bootstrap working together. In this section, we'll dive straight into getting input from the user. In this video, we'll get to understand what Bootstrap and AngularJS bring to the table for the input element. We'll also learn how to add inputs to our page with Bootstrap styling and AngularJS data integration. Finally, we'll look at how data is being manipulated and stored by AngularJS. First, let's have a look at what AngularJS brings to the table for the input element. As we can see in the docs, the new attributes defined by Angular will allow us to respond to the user interacting with the input. If you look down the menu on the left, we can also see there is documentation for many other input modules, or as AngularJS, and we will refer to them from now on, directives. For now, we'll focus on the text, password, and email types. As you can see, there is a directive for email, and for the text and password, we will use the standard input. You can look at the examples on your own, but for now we won't be using any of the specifics of the other input types. If we move back to our code page, we'll add in the 3 fields, but first we'll style up the page to make the form a bit more conspicuous. First, let's replace what we had in our last lessons, Hello World HTML, with a new form element and add a well class. This is a Bootstrap class that allows us to easily mark a part of the page as being separate from the rest, as you can see here. Also, just to make it a bit easier to see, we'll switch over to our script page and bump the form down a bit so it isn't aligned with the top of the browser window. now that we have a good spot to put our form inputs, let's start adding them. First, let's quickly reference our Bootstrap documentation on the classes they defined for this. For our case, this is a good enough start, so we'll just copy over their content to get us going. And we'll tab it up so it lines up. Now let's bind up some data variables and show their output. First, we'll add the scope variables. In this case, we'll create an object called data to hold all the form values. We script over to our script, and we'll change this line to... Now we'll add the bindings back over in the HTML page. Note that we are going to be binding onto a key of the data object, so in this case we do not need to define it beforehand. First, to demonstrate this, we'll add a data output below the form, like so. As you can see, it's shown up over here. And then we'll add the ng models to the email field and the password field like this. Right, now we'll type into the fields to see that the object has the key and value automatically added when the data is entered. This will come in handy when trying to validate the data later. Now we have our basic form inputs set up. In the next video, we'll start having a look at letting the user know when their input data isn't correct. Welcome back to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at adding an input onto the page, styling it with Bootstrap, and binding the data with AngularJS. In this video, we'll have a look at how to make sure the user inputs valid data and how to let them know when it's invalid. To start, let's decide how we want the inputs to look when they aren't correct. Again, to start, we'll have a look at the Bootstrap site. Open up the forms documentation and navigate down to validation states. If we scroll down a bit more and look at the icons options, we can see that this looks more obvious than just the default validation. Let's use this code here to make one input look like it's valid and the other like it's invalid. I'll walk through how to set up the valid input, then I'll get you to pause the video and try to do the invalid input yourself before continuing. I'm going to start by copying over all the content for the success input for reference. We'll just put our reference HTML here. Right. Now I'll start by adding the new class to the form group div, which is this here, has success, has feedback. Then we will change the label to have a class of control label. Finally, to add the span with the icon, which we'll just cut and paste from here after the input. Now if we switch back over to our preview screen again, we can see that it shows up as a valid with a check mark at the end. Now I'd like you to pause the video and have a go at setting up the password input to show us up as invalid. Okay, I assume you've at least had a go now. If you had trouble, I'll still go through setting up the invalid input as we did with the valid input. First of all, we scroll down here and we get the error one, so we copy across has error, has feedback. Copy across class for the control label. Then we'll go grab that icon and drop it in after. And there we go, it shows up as red with a little red cross here. So this is great, but not particularly useful or interactive. So now we'll use a couple of AngularJS directives, namely ngClass and ngShow. First, let's have a look at the docs for ngClass. Let's go back to our AngularJS docs and look up ngClass. So as you can see in this example here, we're going to be using the ngClass to dynamically apply and remove the classes around the inputs. To find the variables that we're going to inspect for our ngClass, we're going to have a look at the form directive here. As you can see here, we can reference the form input's valid or invalid, pristine or dirty state from the front end. You see this is an example form with a required field. So if it's valid, then my form.valid is true. If we delete it, then my form.$valid equals false. So if we switch back over to our code, first we'll need to assign a name to the form and a name to the email input to be able to reference it. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll call the form input form, and then we'll edit our email one and name it email. Next we'll work with the email input, which has some inbuilt email validation already. First, let's cut out the hasSuccess default class, because we don't want it showing as successful all the time. Now we add in the ngClass attribute with the following code. As you can see, we've declared two classes in this ngClass attribute. One is hasSuccess, and this is that hasSuccess will be applied if inputForm.email.dirty, i.e. input has been edited and the email is valid. On the other hand, it will apply the hasError class if input has been edited and the email input is invalid. Alright, now if we switch back to our live preview and we start typing something into our email, it goes red, which means that it is invalid. Now if we make it a valid email address, it turns green. And you will also see that the checkbox is not quite right yet. So the next thing we'll do is change the add an ngClass attribute on the icon. First of all, we're going to remove this glyph icon OK, and then we're going to do the same what we did for the ngClass in the input, except instead of hasSuccess and hasError, we're going to use glyph icon OK and glyph icon remove, which are the two that are being used currently. I'm just going to paste this in now. Here we go. And if we try the form again, we can see the checkbox changes. Now, the great thing about how this code is structured is that it then becomes very easy to use the same code to style the password input. Changing the name to password is necessary. Note that we need to add the required attribute to the password field for anything to show up. Otherwise, it will just show up as valid immediately. So let's go ahead and do that now. Grab the ngClass off the span. I'm just going to close the preview. Copy it, then go down to the span for the password, remove the glyph icon, paste it in, change this to password. Right, then we'll copy the ngClass for the form group. We mustn't forget to give our password field a name. Now let's flick back over to our live preview to see what's happened. As you can see, it's already showing up as red. This means we've forgotten to remove the hasError class. Also, we need to make the field required. Now if we type something in, it goes green. If we remove it, it goes red. And as you can see, the icon is changing as well. So we've now seen how to add validation to the form to let the user know when they've put some incorrect information in. In the next video, we'll have a look at the NG model and how to debug validations. Welcome back. In the last video, we looked at validations on input elements. In this video, we'll have an in-depth look at the NG model and how it interacts with the form validation. First, let's have a look at all the information available on the NG model by outputting it. Now that we have that in place, let's type some data into the inputs. Looking at the output data, we can see all the data as it changes on the model. As we can see, the dirty and its inverse pristine, and invalid and its inverse valid we've already used previously. There are also a couple of other display or boolean flags, namely touched and untouched, and the errors object or error object that you can experiment around to present more detailed feedback to the user. If I change the input values and we have a look at the values, we see some interesting differences between password and email. First, the password has a value in the data object, but email doesn't, as only password is valid. This is useful to know as it means you will never have invalid data in your controller variables as long as you have set up your front-end validators correctly. Secondly, if we look at the NG model value as output from the password input, we see that there is a view value and a model value. It's important to point out here that the value of these two values, the value in the input and the data.password values, are all the same as it is valid. This is the heart of AngularJS's two-way binding. If we compare this with the invalid email NG model output, we see that only a view value that matches the input field value. So from this kit, we can see that view value is what is in the input field and model value is what is in the variable value. What we don't see here that happens behind the scenes is that when a value is sent to the view value by the user entering in something in the input, it gets passed through all of the functions in the passes array, and if it passes all of them, it propagates to the model value and the variable in the scope. If we change the value in the scope, then the value is passed through the formatters instead. So now we have had a look at what goes on behind the scenes in the NG model. We will be able to debug input validations when we need to add them ourselves. The next video is an optional bonus video that covers the use of an open source component called Angular Better Placeholders that makes extensive use of the NG model functions. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In this bonus video, we are going to integrate a third-party open source library for a better user experience, commonly abbreviated to UX. All the important details in this video are covered later on in the course, so you can feel free to skip this and/or come back to it later. First, let's have a look at what this component is. Open up github.com/dmacromad/angularbetterplaceholders. And if we can open this in another tab, we can see a demo of what it is and what it does. If we look at this page here, this is fairly standard for what you can expect from most AngularJS component projects. It's important to note here that all AngularJS projects referred to in this video have their own copyright licenses that you should check before including them in your projects. Now let's get started with the code. First, let's copy over the CSS and JavaScript content into our project and include them. in our main HTML page. If you're using this video's code bundle, I've already set this up for you here. To get this working in our project, first we need to tell the app what to load in. We do this by switching over to our script page and adding in Angular Beta placeholder in the module definition, like that. Next, we need to tell Angular where to place this directive. There are three ways that Angular can be told where to use a directive: as a class, an element, or an attribute. To figure out which ones are supported, we'll look at the Angular Beta placeholders JavaScript file. And specifically, we'll look at the restrict key here. In this case, there is only a capital C here, which means that it can be used only as a class. The other options are A for attribute and E for element. This can be any combination of the above or omitted completely to allow all of them. Now that we know how the directive is going to be used, let's switch over to the HTML view and use it. Let's find the input fields. Check that they have a placeholder value, and then add the Beta placeholder class. Next, we want to remove the label tags as they can get in the way here. And I'm going to do the same for the password field. If we look at our page now, we can see that the layout is much cleaner, and if we enter text, we can see that the color of the label changes and its position moves out of the way in a much nicer fashion than your traditional placeholder. We now have some very slick and compact input boxes. If you want to do some more reading about how this input type is evolving on the web, have a look at google.com/design/spec/components/textfields.html and the text fields floating labels. That concludes our section on getting input. If you're interested in looking at more resources like this, have a look at ngmodules.org for a big list of modules available for Angular. In the next section, we'll be looking at validating and submitting data in a form. Welcome back to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last section, we looked at getting and storing input from users. In this section, we'll have a look at form validation with respect to submitting forms. In this video, we'll start by looking at conditionally disabling submit forms. First, let's look at what options Bootstrap has for displaying and disabling buttons. If we open up the Bootstrap docs, we can see that all we have to do to prevent the user from clicking on the button is to add a disabled attribute. There's nothing new here from standard HTML, and we can see that Bootstrap has added some styling to the button to visually represent this change. Next, let's have a look at AngularJS. If we open up the docs page about the ng-disabled directive, there's a description about why we couldn't just use the curly braces in the attribute value to change the disabled value of the button. So we now know that we'll have to use ng-disabled instead of disabled to change the disabled state dynamically. You might have noticed that there may now be an issue with Bootstrap's disabled button state. But if we look closely at the description, we can see that AngularJS is reading the value inside its attribute as if it were a scope variable and adding or removing the disabled attribute as needed. First, let's switch back over to our code editor and set up a button that we can disable and enable via a scope variable. Enter this into your HTML view in the form. Don't forget those Bootstrap button classes. As we can see here, this button is actually not disabled. This is due to the way ng-disabled works. Basically, everything in the ng-disabled attribute is treated as a Boolean variable on the scope. the evaluation of the attribute automatically assumes that all variable names are a variable on the scope, so in this case, as we haven't defined the disabled variable, it evaluates to false, as undefined is equivalent to false in JavaScript. If we were to write up this logic as a JavaScript function, it would look something like this. Let's go ahead and add in the proper disabled boolean. Now that we have our scoped variables, let's have a look at how our page is rendering. And as we can see, the test button is now disabled. The final step now is to change this button so that it is only enabled when the form is valid. Let's do that now. So we want the button to be disabled when the form is invalid or it hasn't been edited, i.e. pristine. And as you remember, we can put a Boolean expression in. So we're going to do this. And if we enter in some data, once both fields are valid, our button is now not disabled. We have successfully disabled the button. We are now on our way to making this form submit only valid data. In the next video, we are going to have a closer look at the AngularJS ngForm and ngSubmit directives, which help us with actually submitting data from the form. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at disabling buttons. Now we'll extend this concept by looking into form submission. First, let's examine the form directive in AngularJS. Most of this we will be familiar with as we have been using it in our validation so far. As we look down the page, we can see some useful attributes of the form directive, like the classes, which allow us to style the form element without having to declare extra ng-class attributes. Here's the section we are most interested in. I'd like you at this point to pause the video and read through this section I've highlighted, as it is useful to understand this if you don't know much about how a form works in HTML. It also covers in detail the differences between a more traditional form submission and how this is normally done in AngularJS and why. In our case, we're going to use the ngSubmit directive. Let's jump back to our code. First, let's add the ngSubmit directive to the form. Let's make it call a function called submit when the form is submitted. We also need to make the button a submit button, so let's do that too. Now let's create this function in our JavaScript. As a side note, you will often hear this referred to as the controller, whereas the HTML is referred to as the view. These are terms that are used to describe a model view controller or MVC framework. For now, we'll get our function to display an alert on the screen when the form is submitted, like this. Great, let's test this out by trying to submit the form. It works. We can also see that the validation of the button we set up earlier prevents the form from submitting when it's invalid as well. Lastly, we want to output the form data when the form is submitted. For now, we'll just output it to the console. Let's just output the password and email in the alert for now by typing this. If we submit the form now, we can see the email and password have been outputted in the alert. As you can see, we have successfully trapped the submit event of the form and displayed the data we wanted to submit. In the next video, we'll have a look at what we are going to do with that data in submitting with AJAX. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at how AngularJS handles form submission. In this video, we are going to have a look at how to submit that data to a server. First, you'll need to download and open the code bundle for this section. If you've been following along and coding as we go, you'll need to update your code from the code bundle, as I have added a service that allows us to simulate a HTTP server. If you just want to update your files, then you need to change these lines in the JavaScript and then add this line to the HTML, which entered the AngularJS module. Now that we're all set up, let's go and read up on what the HTTP service provides for us. Here we'll be interested in the get and post functions. There are lots of details in here that can be useful to know later on, but for now all we will need is this example here for now. Next, let's have a go at sending some posts in our code. Let's type up two posts, one with the correct login data and the other with the incorrect data, and then dump out what's returned to the console. Right, now let's switch over to our live preview and open up the console. As you can see, we got two post results back: a failure with a logged in false, a success with a logged in true, and a user ID. Right, let's now set this up so that when the user submits the form, we post the form data to our pretend server. Now we'll see the significance of putting all of our form variables in one object on the scope. As all we have to do is send the scope data object. Let's try this and see what happens. It's important to note that for this example, the email address must be test@test.com and the password must be test, all lowercase. After a short delay, we can see that the correct data has been posted to our server. Now that we have successfully been able to submit some data to the server, you may have noticed some problems, like we could click the submit button many times in a row, and that there isn't any feedback on whether we put the correct data in the fields. In the next video, we will address these issues. Welcome back to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at how to post data to a server. In this video, we are going to have to give some feedback to the user about that process. Our first and simplest task will be to stop the user from submitting the form while an AJAX post is taking place. We do this by defining a new flag variable on the scope, loading, and initializing it to false. Then we want to make this variable true for the duration of the post, so at the start of the submit function we set loading equals true, and when the post returns a value we set loading equals false. Now we'll switch over to our HTML page and make the button disabled when loading is true. The way we are going to do this is by adding loading to the ngDisabled of the attribute of the submit button. Now we'll test this out to demonstrate. It's disabled and then becomes re-enabled when we get the post back. This is good, but a user could be a bit confused as to what has gone wrong or what's happening. Let's add an icon that appears when the post is being sent. First, let's add a little icon or message next to the submit button, like so. Now we only want to show this while loading is true. For this case, we'll use a new directive called ngShow. This AngularJS directive changes the display style of the element to show and hide the element. Its inverse is ngHide. Let's go ahead and add ngShow directive like we did with the ngDisabled, but with the value of loading. Now, if we submit the form again, we can see that the message appears briefly and then disappears when the post has finished processing. Lastly, we want to display a message letting the user know if they submitted the correct data or not. For starters, let's have a look at Bootstrap's alert component. For now, we want to use the green and red alerts, which we can see are defined as follows. Let's get 2 alerts to display at the top of the form. Now that we have our 2 alerts, we want these to be displayed at different times. Let's do this with some ng-shows again. This time we'll use a new variable called postResult, and when it is 1, show the success. When it is 2, we'll show the error message like so. Switching over to our JavaScript, let's initialize this variable to 0, meaning that neither of them will show up. Next, let's jump down to our post function. The post in this case returns a Boolean key called logged in. We'll set postResult to 1 if it's true or 2 if it's false. Let's test this out by putting in some bad inputs and pressing submit. There's our error message. Now let's put in the correct email and password and hit submit. Here is an important lesson in capitalization. As I wrote logged in with a lowercase I, it was returning false every time. Now that I've corrected the capitalization, we get our success message. In conclusion, we have learned about using a variable to stop the user from submitting a form while some long processes like a post is running. We've discovered the ng-show directive and used it to display feedback during and after the post event. In the next section, we'll learn about creating single-page apps which look like they have multiple pages. Welcome back to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last section, we looked at using Angular and Bootstrap to tell the user that a particular form field is required. In this section, we'll be looking at the core of Angular's single-page application framework, the ng-route module. The ng-route module allows us to show many pages to the user without the browser having to refresh the web page. Let's start by looking at the routing example in the Angular docs. Open up this page and scroll down to the example at the bottom. This is the $route service in the ng-route module. In this example, there is one main page, the index.html, 2 templates, book and chapter, and the JavaScript page. Looking at the index page, we can see some fairly familiar attributes. There's the controller attribute, and some bound attributes down the bottom. The new attribute here is this ngView attribute. First of all, we're going to see this in action straight away. I'm going to switch between the Gatsby and Moby links. As you can see here, it says that the controller is book controller and the book ID is Moby. But as you've probably noticed, there's nothing in the index page that would display this content. The trick here is in the ngView directive. It is loading up the content of the route defined by the link we clicked on. If we now look over to the book.html template, we can see where the controller and book ID HTML and bindings are defined. If we now click on the Moby Chapter 1 link, we can see some new text that is defined in the chapter.html template. You're probably wondering what's the difference in between this and, say, using a tabbing plugin to change what's being shown. The first advantage is that we can use dynamic URLs to load data. If we look over at the index page, we can see all of these hrefs here that have different URLs, and if we click on them in the example, we can see the string values of the URL are being loaded into the params variable. It's here, to here. You see key equals value and key is value in the params. The second advantage is that we can separate the logic for each page into a separate controller, and as we've seen, the templates allow us to separate the display HTML for each page as well. While this doesn't sound terribly useful right now, in larger projects it is a lot more useful. Right, now let's have a look over at the controller setup in Script.js. As I mentioned before, we can see that there are three controllers. One for the main page, and then one for each different template, book and chapter. They are fairly basic in and of themselves, so we'll look at the first new section down here, the config section. This is one of the two functions that run when a module is loaded. As we can see here, the config function is being used to set up the route provider. And as we can see, there are two when functions being called. These correspond to the URL of the links we saw in the index page. We can interpret this as follows. When the URL ends with /book/some string, which will be stored in the book ID variable in the params, we load up the template URL book.html and load it with the controller book controller. Don't worry about the resolve option for now, we'll come back to it later. Okay, so now we have a basic idea of routing. Let's add a basic second page to our app. First, we have to include the ng-route module in our HTML. This has two parts, the first being the source file, the second is to load it into our module. Now let's move our current code into a template and our content into a subcontroller. First, let's create a controller called user control. We'll move all of our previous code into here. We'll just cut and paste. And don't forget to set up our controller again. Next, we create a new file called user.tpl.html and move the form from our index page into there. Again, we'll just cut, paste, then fix up the tabbing. Back in our index.html, we'll add the ngView attribute to our container class, which originally contained our HTML content. Lastly, to get everything up and running, we need to get the config function set up correctly. To do this, we're going to inject two more providers into the config, first being route provider, the second being location provider. Next, we'll add our version of the routing from the example page. So we define route provider, our when, we'll go /login as our URL, and we define the template URL and the controller. Lastly, we add an extra function call called otherwise, and set that if basically this defines what happens when none of the other route provider whens are matched. We'll get this to just redirect to the login route. Lastly, we're going to turn on the HTML5 mode. This gives us nice URLs to look at in the example. Now, if we load up our page now, we can see that our page has been set up to use routes. And if we inspect the element here, we can see that everything has been put inside the element with the ngView in it. In conclusion, we have learnt what the ng-route module does, why we would want to use it, and how to set up our application for use in it. In our next video, we'll look at how to add a second page and use an event to load it up. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at using Angular's ng route module. In this video, we're going to look more in depth at how to manage multiple pages with the ng route module. Our first step will be to add a second route and page and load this page up when the user submits the form we created earlier. We'll call this second page a report page, so we'll add a new template called report.htpl.html. We'll add in some basic HTML in here. It's important to note that Angular requires the template to have one base element that contains everything else. Next, we'll add a controller called report control and the related routing, like so. First, we'll add another controller down the bottom. Then we'll add our new route up in here in our config function. We'll set the URL to /report. We set up our template URL and controller like last time. To test this, we'll add two links with the when routes as the link href to the index.html page. We'll add them above our ng view so we can view them always. Now if we click on these links, you can see the view changing. Note that there was a slight delay the first time we clicked on the report button due to the template being loaded. Now that we have our two-page routing set up, our next step will be to change the submit function of the form on the login page to load up the report page. To do this properly, we will introduce a new service called $location. Let's open up the docs for this now. This service works similar to the window.location of vanilla JavaScript. By vanilla, we mean without any other libraries like jQuery, except that it interacts with the routing module rather than the browser page itself. If we scroll down a bit, we find this URL method here. This is what we'll use to change the page. Let's get it working. First, we have to inject the location service into our controller. Next, we want to redirect the user if the user is logged in correctly. So we'll add that to the correct if statement down here. Here we go, if logged in. So we'll change this into a not inline if statement. We want to write location.url and then the URL that we want to be sent to. It's important to note here we need the /report in this case, whereas on the front end we didn't need the //. Alright, let's go test it out and see how it works. We put in our valid data, which is test@test.com, password test, submit, success function, and we've changed the report page. Lastly, we will set up our routing to load up some JSON when the report page is loaded. We can do this in a simple HTTP call in the controller, but that code will only execute when our page is loaded. We are going to use the resolve option you may have noticed earlier from the routing module to make sure that this data is loaded before the route resolves. First of all, we'll just create a basic JSON template called report.json. This will be our JSON data that we'll be loading up. So to get this to load up in the right place, we'll switch back over to our script controllers. Then we'll go to the when of the report and we add a new key to the report object called resolve. Now this is an object of keys. We're going to call this report data and then we define this as another injector. Then we're going to return HTTP GET of report.json. As this returns a promise, we need to transform the then function to return only the data, not the rest of the HTTP information. We simply do this by creating a function which returns the data version. Next, let's display this data so we can see that it's working. We'll add to the report controller the report data. You notice this is the same name that we gave the key of the resolve object. And then we're going to set the scope data of this controller to be the report data. Lastly, let's switch over to our report template and dump out the JSON. Let's load up our form and test it again. And there we go, our JSON data has been loaded up and dumped out. In conclusion, we have seen how to set up a second route, how to use links to change the routes, how to use the location service to change routes, and lastly, how to load up data when the route loads. In our next video, we will look at sharing data between routes using a service. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at Angular's routing events. In this video, we are going to look at how to share data between routes. To achieve our goal, we are going to write our first service. In brief, services in AngularJS are functions or objects that are initialized once and then can be injected into multiple controllers to share data or code. Let's have a look at the Angular documentation for some more details. Open up code.angularjs.org/1.3.0 docs guide services. From the description of Angular services here, we can see this is exactly what we want. Something that will persist data across all of our controllers. Okay, let's scroll down to registering services and grab some code to get going. Right, copy this selection of code into our script.js file like so. Next, let's rename the service to user data. Then let's add a data variable like we used in the user control controller and return it. Cool. Now let's inject this into our controllers and link it up. Right, first of all, we're going to insert it into the user control. First, we put this into our injection list. We put in user data. And we're going to change the scope.data to be set to user data object. Alright, next let's hook it into the report controller. So we do the same, user data injection. Next we'll add in some more variables to load up the data. Now we'll change the report template to say hello to the user's email address. So we go back to our report template. So it currently says hello report. We're going to change this. Now if we fill out our form, submit it, and when the reports page loads up, it says hello test@test.com, like put into the email field. Okay, so we have successfully created a service in this, and we've used that service to share an object reference, which is some low-level variable information in that we get the same object in both controllers without having to do any JavaScripting. This concludes our main section on routing. The next video is an optional bonus video which covers how to animate the routes changing over. Welcome to this bonus video of web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In this section we have looked at Angular's routing functionality. In this video we are going to look at how to use the inbuilt classes Angular adds to the ngView directive to add some funky animations to the route change events. As a warning, this video uses CSS3 transitions. If you're not familiar with these, then you can view an excellent tutorial at css3.bradshawenterprises.com here. Or alternatively, this video can be skipped without affecting the remainder of the course. First, let's have a look at our documentation. Open up the ngView docs and scroll down to animations. As is stated here, there are two animations applied: enter and leave. It's important to note here that all classes that Angular adds to elements are prefixed with ng-, so the classes we want to trigger are ng-enter and ng-leave. Next, we are going to need to add a couple more resources to our project. The first is the ng-animate module. This turns on all of the animations. Without it, the ng-enter and ng-leave classes aren't added. So I'll add that script tag now. Then we'll switch over to our script.js file and inject ng-animate into the module like so. Now our animations are active, but we haven't added any yet. Next, I've prepared a stripped down version of animate.css in the code bundle. You can see the full version over at dan.github.io/animate.css. This is a great library for looking at different kind of CSS animations that can be used, and you can have a look at that on your own. But for now, let's go back over to our index page and just include the animate CSS file. Right, I'll quickly run over what's in the animate.css file so the rest makes more sense. As you can see, the first declaration is a change to the .container class. This helps our animations overlay each other nicely. As you can see, it's absolute positioned with the top, right and left. Next, you can see the ng-enter and ng-leave animation declarations, with an animation duration of 1 second and fill mode both. If we scroll down a bit more, we can see that two classes are required to trigger the animations. This is so we can use separate animations for each page's leave and enter animations. As we can see, there are two classes, login.ngleave and login.ngenter. Then down here, report.ngenter and report.ngleave. Next, we should open up the script.js and add this variable into each of our controllers. Oops, I've got them backwards. Our last step to get all the animations working is to make sure that these classes are added in at the right place at the right time. So we'll go back over to the index.html and we'll change this class here, its ng class value, to be page class. Now, as we can see, the animations, we have a slide down and slide up for the login and a zoom in and out for the report page. This concludes our bonus video on animating routes. In our next section, we'll look at displaying data in more detail. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last section, we looked at using Angular's route module to show multiple pages without needing to refresh the page. In this section, we're going to have a look at displaying data with ng repeats. In the code bundle for this video, I have updated the report.json file with some sample code. In this case, it's just some fictional customers. If we open up the report page we built in the last section, we can see that the data in the report.json file is dumped out as is. In this video we will be using the ng-repeat directive to display this data in a table. First, let us look into the Angular docs for the ng-repeat directive. This directive is one of the more complicated ones to fully understand. In brief, it iterates over an array or struct, so for now we're going to jump down to the example and adapt that for our use. As we can see here, the ng-repeat is being used on the list elements, or li elements, in the list, and inside them we are outputting the data. Let's jump straight in and add a basic table to our code. We'll come back to look at the Bootstrap stylings for the table later in the video. Here, our data loaded from the server is in the same format as the friends array from the example, so we can use the same ng-repeat syntax. Next, we need to identify the HTML element that we want to repeat for each element in the array. In the example, it was an li element. In our case, we'll want a table row or tr element to be repeated. So let's add in our table, then our table row with the ng-repeat. Our table row will have the ng-repeat attributes on it like so. And lastly, in the TD of the table, let's just output the row variable to see what happens. Now let's have a look at what this looks like now. As you can see, this is nearly the same output data as it did before, but if we look carefully, we're now missing the opening and closing square brackets of the array. Let's see what Bootstrap has that could make this a bit easier to see. So in our case, we'll want this table class, and let's get a striped rows and a bordered table as well. So here's the table striped and table bordered. So let's go back over and add them to our table. Now if we look at our report page, we can see a bit better what is being output in each row. In this case, the ng-repeat is making the report row variable equal to an element in the array in each case. Let's output this data a bit better now. So we'll change our td report row to have output the name, balance, the dob, and the gender. Right, let's go look at our report page again. Okay, so that looks a bit better, but some headers would help our user out, so let's add them now. So we'll change our table to have a t-head section, or a table head section. Our table row, th name, balance, date of birth, and gender. We'll also wrap our data in a t-body. Though this is not strictly necessary, it's good to keep the table data structured so, because more complicated nested repeats, we will often repeat a t-body and then other trs inside them. Right, let's have a look at our work. Whoops, I've made a mistake here. There we go, much better. Alright, that concludes this video introducing the ng-repeat. In the next video, we'll be looking into filters to further improve the formatting of our data. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at displaying data with ng-repeats. In this video, we're going to look at filters and how they can be used to augment our display. Filters are used in Angular to modify data in a reusable way. For example, if you wanted to capitalize the first letter in a lowercase string but not change the actual string. To start, we'll open up the filter page in the Angular docs. This is a list of all of the inbuilt filters in Angular. Each provides a description and example of what it does. To start with, we're going to use the currency filter to the balance column of our report page. As you can see here, this is a fairly straightforward filter. We just add a vertical bar and the currency keyword into a key binding. We could also put symbol and fraction size if we wanted, but we won't use them for now. Right, let's do that right now and see what happens. Right, let's open up our report template again, and we'll go to the balance, add in the currency filter, loading up the report again. See that it's filtered as standard dollar currency. As an exercise, I'd like you to do the same for the date of birth column using the date filter. For reference, the date filter is here again. Pause this video and have a go. Great, now that you've hopefully had a go, I'll quickly go through the steps I did to complete this. First, I have a look at the docs for the date. You can see there's a date and then optional formats. So you could format the date in any way you wanted. For now, we'll just use the default format. There we go, nice date format. Pretty easy. Right, next we're going to use the order by filter to sort the table via a select box. If we look at the docs for this, we can see that the order by filter requires one column and an optional second. The predicate is the name of the object keys, and reverse will reverse the order. First, we want to add the defaults to our controller. These will define how the table is sorted at the start. We'll start with name and not reversed. So we'll switch over to our script.js, find the report controller, and we'll add in scope.predicate equals name, and scope.reverse equals false. Right, next, let's add this filter to the ngRepeat directive in the report template. Right, just like in the example, as we chose to use the same variable names, it's fairly straightforward, but these could be any variables you want. Now, if you look here, you can see that the name column and the rest of the table has been ordered by first name alphabetically. Right, next we want to be able to display what the sorting key is and allow the user to change it. We're going to do this simply by a click event on the headers. First, let's create the click event in the controller. Okay, first of all, the order by function will take in a predicate name function. This will be the name of the column value we're sorting it by. First, we check if the predicate name is equal to the current predicate. If so, we're going to change the reverse of the ordering. Otherwise, we'll set the predicate to the predicate name passed in. Remembering to reset the reverse filter as well. Next, we want to wire this up to the front end and display those sort arrows you'll commonly see on tables in the headers. First, let's add the click events to the th elements, putting the predicate name of that column in each one. I'll just copy this to make it quicker. We see for our name column, we put in name, which is the name of the object value down here. And for balance, dob, and gender. Right, now let's add in an icon that is only shown when sorting by that predicate and swaps between an up and down when the reverse is changed. I'll do this first for the name and then copy and edit for the rest of them. If you're wondering about this glyphicon class, this is a set of icons that comes with Bootstrap. Right, to make this a bit simpler, I'm going to store this object into the report class scope. Right, now that I've done that for name, I'm going to copy and paste that into the rest of them, changing the predicate quality to the correct value. Note that the reverse value filters oppositely for text or numeric and date values. So for our date of birth and balance, we're going to have to change this, swap the reverse and not reverse values around for the classes. Right, let's quickly preview this before we go on to the next bit. Lastly, we're going to add the option to filter the data by name. First, we'll open up the docs, go back and have a look at the filter. For now, all we need to know is that for every element in an array, it tests to see if that element matches the object we pass to the filter. Right, first, we need to set up in our report template a simple text input for our name filter. We'll use the code from earlier, except that our ng model will be filter.name, and this will be a type text input. We could also use a type equals search if we wanted a slightly different input, but we'll leave that for later. Next, we'll add the filter to our ng repeat, like in the docs. Note that we should filter before we order. Now, if we preview our work, we can see that we can filter the data by typing in the name field. You see we type in COO and it filters down to the Cooper. C has only the ones with C in their name. And likewise, we can still sort with the filter. Right, this concludes our video about filters. In the next video, we'll look into some more advanced interactions with the ng repeat directive. Welcome back to web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we looked at using filters to better display data. In this video, we are going to look at some more complex ways to iterate data. 3 problems we are going to solve here are 1. Outputting a list of values from a user's selected group of rows. This is useful if you want to select several people to send an email to or reset their passwords. 2. We're going to delete a row and its data in the array. 3. We're going to display the array of tags using a nested ng repeat that you may have noticed if you look through the reports.json file. Right, first we will output a list of email addresses in an alert based on the value of some checkboxes we will add to the table. To start, let's add a checkbox to each row in the repeat and bind it to a value on the row like so. Don't forget to add in an empty header. Right, now outside of our table, we will need to create the button to trigger our output. We'll call it send emails, and its ng click value will be a call to the function send emails that we will create shortly. Right, now we'll switch over to our controller and add in the send emails function. The simplest way to do this is to loop over the data array and grab every email address that is selected. You could alternatively use reduce function, but for now we'll just stick with the loop. Right, if we switch over to our preview, open up the report page, check a couple of these rows, and then hit send emails. Doesn't quite work as expected. This is because I've put row.selected, not report row.selected. We'll wait for it to refresh, and we'll try that again. There you go, this time it's output an alert with the names. There is one bug that is not immediately obvious here, and it wasn't the one where I named it incorrectly. Is if we select some people then change the filter to exclude them, there should be no emails sent, in theory. But if we try this, we can see that the filter has no effect. Like if we filter this now on G, only Gilliam shows up. If we go filter, it now shows up as all of them are still being sent. Right, to fix this, we need to filter our array before getting the emails. Right, first, we need to add the service into our controller. This service allows us to manually call the same filters that we were calling in the HTML page earlier. Now we're going to alter our send email function to make use of the filtered array instead of the unfiltered array. Now if we test it again, we can see if the user cannot see a checkbox, the user's email will not be displayed in our alert. Right, now we'll move on to part 2, deleting a row. To do this first, we want to create a button in the row, like so. Not forgetting to add in the Bootstrap styling classes. Next, our problem is how do we tell the delete row function which element of the array to remove? If you read the ngRepeat docs earlier, you would think we could use the $index variable here like so, and then just splice out that value of the array, index of the array. The problem with this approach is like the problem we had with the email. If the array is filtered or sorted, this index value won't be the same as the row's index in the original array. It would be the displayed row index. This is useful in other cases, but not here. For now, the best way to do this is to pass in the entire row and then use object reference equalities in the controller to figure out what the index is. Right, now we'll go and create our delete row function. Create our function that takes in a row. Now it's important to declare the iterator value outside of the for loop. The reason for this is that we want to be able to use that value once we've finished in the loop. And basically we break out of the loop once we get a match. And then we use the splice value to remove one row at the index where we got an object equality match. Right, now if we test out this, well, first of all we'll try to delete the Cooper Hayden, which works. Then we will filter down and try and delete someone else. Here it's correct, those two people we've just deleted are in the list. Our last task for this video is to get the nested tags array in the data and display it using the Bootstrap labels. Here are the tags here. To make things more interesting, we are going to alternate between the dark blue label primary class and the light blue label info class. If we look over here, we have a primary and an info class, and they're label primary and label info. Alright, let's go back to the report template. Alright, we'll add an extra column, but we'll add it before the delete column because we want the delete button to be last. Now we'll make a span with an ngRepeat in it. I'm going to output the tag name. Right, now let's add our classes. First we want to add the generic label class. And a small margin class. Next, we're going to add in an ng class value and utilize the odd and even variables the ng repeat generates for us. I'm going to make the primary one every even row, and the info label every odd row. Right, if we have a look at the display now, it looks okay. If we load it up, here you go. But it could do with a bit more space between the tags. So we'll go over to our style.css file, and we'll add in a .label class as a child of table cell, and we'll say margin right 4 pixels. There we go, that looks much better now. This concludes our section on displaying data. We've learned about the ng repeat and filters in a few combinations. In the next section, we will look into adding extra flair to our app with third-party libraries. Welcome back to Web Development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last section, we looked at using Angular's ng repeat and filter components, which helped us in displaying data. In this section, we're going to have a look at integrating third-party modules into our application. The aim of this is to leverage the open source community to improve our application without having to rewrite everything ourselves. As this is the start of the last section, I'm going to take this opportunity to encourage you to get involved in an open source project and help out. I found that this is the best way of learning about the internals of AngularJS, which can often help with some of those tricky problems you'll come across. The other reason I would encourage this is that the open source community relies on people like us who use their projects contributing our time to better them for everyone. Alright, on to the main content now. Let's start by opening up the AngularStrap homepage. If you've had an explore around the Bootstrap docs, specifically the JavaScript page, this would look very familiar. As you can see down the left nav, this library has modals, asides, alerts, tooltips, and many other directives. All of these are Angular native directories that do what their equivalents in Bootstrap do. You'll be forgiven for thinking at this point, why would we want to duplicate what Bootstrap's components do in another library? The basic reason is that Bootstrap's components are built in jQuery, so to use them we need to include an additional unnecessary library. The other reason is that jQuery doesn't always play well with Angular without some extra work due to Angular's binding loop. As an introduction, we'll compare the modal in AngularStrap with the version in Bootstrap. Here you can see how the modal in AngularStrap works. Now let's have a look at the version in Bootstrap. As you can see, there is not much difference in between them. If you look at the code examples of these two, you will quite quickly spot the differences, but we will come back to that in the next video. For now, we'll run through the getting started and using tooltips, which are a much simpler example to start off with. Like before, we should grab the script tags here from the quick start page and copy them into our main HTML page as shown. Next, we need to tell Angular that we want to use this module. If we jump back to the docs, we can see this module is called mccrea.ngstrap. For ease of use, I'm just going to copy that here. Go over to our scripts, scroll up, and put it in the injection list. Right, so we're all set up. Let's see how we can use the tooltip plugin. As you can see, there are quite a few ways of displaying a tooltip. We're going to display a tooltip on the login page's inputs when they are focused, and then display a tooltip on the submit button only when it is disabled. Right, first for the inputs. We see that here that the attribute we need to add is called BS tooltip. and its contents should either be an object with a title or a string. In this case, if we are just going to use a string. We'll edit the email input first. And then I'm going to copy this down to the password field. Not forgetting to make this an actual string, not a series of variables. Right, next we are going to use the data trigger attribute to make the tooltip appear only when we are focused on the input. This is similar to the example. And we copy it onto our second input as well. Right, now let's do the same for the submit button, except this time there are some complications. Earlier on we set up the button to be disabled if we shouldn't be able to submit the form. Unfortunately, disabling a button also means that the hover and click events do not work, which means that if we just repeat what we did with the inputs, it won't work with the button. To get around this, we will wrap the button in a div element and apply the tooltip to it. A point to be aware here is that we need to enable the display inline block styling. This gets the div to cover the exact same area as the button. We'll also use a data placement right to position it better. And then we'll use BS enabled to only show the tooltip when the form is invalid or not filled out. Okay, to finish up for this video, let's have a look at the output of our work. Right, if we focus in, we can see the inputs showing up. If we hover, it tells us to please complete all the fields. Now if we fill out some of the data, here we go. Right, that concludes this video introducing AngularJS. In the next video, we'll start looking at a couple of the more advanced directives included in AngularJS. Welcome to the last video of web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. In the last video, we introduced the basics of AngularJS. In this video, we will look at two of the more complex directives, modal and type ahead, or as it is more commonly known, autocomplete. We'll start with the type ahead, as usual in the documentation. As we see from the docs, the type ahead is applied to an input. We provide it with some options in the ngOptions directive attribute, and it takes care of the rest for us. We'll emulate the state type ahead, as it is the simplest of them all. Right, our first step should be creating an array in the controller for the type ahead to populate. For this, we're going to map the report data function. This allows us to transform all the values in an array to equivalent values of some other sort. In this case, we're going to take what was an object and return a name instead. Right, next, we'll follow their example and add the attributes to the search box. So if we open up the report template, find our search box. First off, we're going to add the BS type ahead, which takes no value, and then ngOptions, which is defined very similar to an ngRepeat. For more details on this, you should go and look at the ngOptions in AngularJS's main documentation. This is normally used for the select. Right, let's open up our preview and have a look and see if it works. There we go. Looking good. Our type ahead worked correctly. Right, next we'll get a help modal up and running. If we look at the examples in the docs, we're going to use the custom modal example here. In our case, we want to avoid an additional HTTP request back to the server to load the page, so we're going to introduce a new directive, ngTemplate. I know I call it the ngTemplate directive, but it's actually a script with a type text equals ngTemplate. Simply put, the contents of this script tag are compiled and placed in the modal template by the modal directive. First, we'll create our template. To do this, we'll start by copying the default modal template from the AngularJS repository and pasting it into our index.html. So here's the repository, and we're going to go through src, up the modal, template, select all the contents and copy it. Now if we go back over to our index.html, scroll down to the bottom, and then at the bottom of the body we're going to add in a script with the correct type of text ngTemplate. We're going to set an ID, then we paste our content inside like so. Right, now we'll edit this template here to suit our purposes a bit better. First of all, we'll change the title tag to say help modal. Then we will change the modal body class to, instead of being bound to whatever the content is, have some simple text in it. And we also need to remove all of these ng-show and hide tags. Now that we've got our template set up, let's create a button to trigger it. We'll start again by looking at the example on the AngularJS site. Right, as you can see, it's a button with a data template that looks very much like what our idea of our ngTemplate script is, and bs-modal equals modal. Right, let's go and add that into our index, and we'll put that in just before the login and report buttons. We don't need to put anything in the bs-modal attribute as we're not actually using any data. And we add in our template. So we've got to remove the ng-bind equals title as well. Let's test it out. Here we go. It tells us that this modal is designed to help the user with the application. This concludes the video on modals and type heads in AngularJS. I hope this video course has been useful to you and you have learned how to use the basic AngularJS and Bootstrap. I wish you all the best and hope you continue to extend your expertise in these libraries and create tons of cool websites. So long, and thanks for all the fish.